Ambassador Taylor is the Executive Vice President of the United States Institute of Peace. This conference began 6 years ago with a grant which Johnson County Community College wrote and received from the U.S. Institute for Peace for this conference. And so one of the reasons we wanted to invite him here, one of the many reasons, is that we wanted to say thank you for the money and look what you started. Ambassador Taylor earlier was the Special Coordinator for Middle East Transitions in the U.S. Department of State. He oversaw assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. Ambassador Taylor also served as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet, which facilitated the Israeli disengagement from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. He also served with the U.S. government in Baghdad in Iraq and in Afghanistan. He was the coordinator of U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Early in his career, he served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley. Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point and of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and in Germany. Ambassador Taylor is married with 2 adult children. Please join me in giving him a big Kansas City welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think this works. Now, is this, because I can speak louder, or this we can use, this is, okay, I hear it. Thank you. It's great to be back in Kansas City. I was here not that long ago. I'm very pleased to be reminded that the Institute of Peace had some role in getting this conversation going. And it's a dynamic conversation that I'm thrilled to be able to come back and participate in. And so thank you all very much for the invitation back. Thanks to Steve for starting us off with this kind of a big picture on peace building. The Institute of Peace, where I work, is an organization in the U.S. government that the Congress established so that there would be some place in the government that thinks about how to resolve conflicts peacefully. As Jeanette mentioned, I spent some time early in my career in an organization in the U.S. government that thinks about how to resolve how to resolve conflicts violently. And so the Congress wanted a place, Institute of Peace, that thought about how conflicts can be resolved through dialogue, through negotiation, through a better understanding of how conflict works. There are a lot of the pieces of the Institute of Peace, which I will save for any questions, but the theme that I would like to talk about, that I got the opportunity to talk about, that I was asked to talk about, is stories from the field. And so as Steve said, there's an importance, there's a value in measuring what we do so that we can show that it is possible. Our motto at the Institute of Peace is peace is possible. It's practical, and it's important for our national security, but it is possible, and we need to show that if you work hard, if you understand the conflict, then it's possible to have some effect on these conflicts. We do it in a couple of ways. We do this work on peace building in a couple of ways. We do it from what we call the kind of the bottom up, which I've got an example for you on, as well as the top down. So bottom up is working at grassroots, working on the sources of conflict, working on what leads societies and peoples and communities to want to solve disputes violently. So that's kind of the bottom up work, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. We also, however, work on the top down, and the top down is often at the national level. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in Afghanistan at the national level. Later on, we do some work on Ukraine. There's a conflict in Ukraine that you may have heard about, that the Russians have invaded part of Ukraine, and we're working on kind of the top-down version of that as well. So let me, when we were talking about stories from the field, I was coming in last night, and Matthew was reminding me that was the theme of this morning, stories from the field. And I was telling him, yeah, I've got a couple of stories on this. This is great for me to be able to tell stories from the field. And he said he's got stories from the cornfield. And so he's got now, Matthew, you're sitting way over there. But you should come here. It's a safe distance, but you don't need it. This is a peaceful organization here. So let me tell two stories, one on the bottom up and one on top down. And this will get to Steve's point about results and measuring results and telling people, including people in Kansas City and other parts of the country, what we do. Because we want to be sure that people in the world, people in particular in the country, understand that some of their taxpayer dollars going to fund the Institute of Peace. And as I said, the Congress established us in order to do this kind of work, so I want you to evaluate if you're getting your money's worth on this. So let me start with Iraq. One of Steve's measures there, recognizing the limitations of some of the listings that you pointed out. It's a good point. But Iraq is either 157 or 158. So, I mean, it's down in the bottom group. Afghanistan's also down there too. I'm going to come back to Afghanistan. But so this is one of the places where there's not positive peace, where we got problems. And we've had problems in Iraq, as everybody knows, since 2003. And part of the problem in Iraq emerged in about 2014. So this is the beginning of my story about the field, beginning of my story about Iraq. So in 2014, you will remember, ISIS moved through northern Iraq. It moved quickly through northern Iraq and overran many of the cities, many of the military formations, and set up a caliphate in the northern part of Iraq and Syria. One of the cities that they overran was a city called Tikrit. And Tikrit, you may remember, was where Saddam Hussein came from. That was his hometown. It was largely, predominantly Sunni city. And ISIS, predominantly a Sunni organization, entity, overran it. And it overran a military base near Tikrit. And the military base was actually a base that the American Army, when we were there, had called Camp Spiker. So by this time, in 2014, you will recall that the U.S. forces had been drawn way down. We had essentially withdrawn. ISIS moved in, took advantage of that, overran Tikrit, overran Camp Spiker. When we left, the Iraqi military established a training base at Camp Spiker, using the facilities, the infrastructure that we had put in there, and then turned over to the Iraqi Army and Air Force. And they established a training facility there, and they were training their young Air Force cadets, the Iraqi Air Force. Turns out that most of those young cadets were Shia from the southern part of Iraq. Tikrit, as I mentioned, is in the Sunni communities. And so when ISIS overran Camp Spiker with this training base established by the Iraqi army, mostly Shia, ISIS massacred 1,700 cadets. A horrible massacre that we didn't find out the full effect of, the full dimension of, until we went back in there. But this massacre was traumatic, obviously, as you can understand. Fast forward about 6 months, when the Iraqi army, together with Shia militia, reinforcing each other, pushed ISIS back out of Tikrit, back out of Camp Speicher, back out, eventually, as we know, back out of Iraq. So the Iraqi army pushed them back out and regained control of the city of Tikrit and of Camp Speicher. As I mentioned, Tikrit is mostly a Sunni community. The Iraqi army was manned, if you will, by mostly Shia forces, Shia soldiers. The Sunni community in Tikrit was terrified. They were glad to see the ISIS forces pushed out, but they were also worried about revenge killing for that massacre. So the Institute of Peace, we have had, the Institute of Peace has had people, we've had offices both in Baghdad and in Erbil up in the Kurdish region since 2004, 2005. So we've been there for a long time. What we've done, and Steve highlighted this as well, is we've been able to partner with Iraqis. And we've, with the Iraqis, established non-governmental organizations and other organizations that work on reconciliation, work on negotiation, facilitate dialogue. Now those are the mechanisms, those are the tools of peace building. Dialogue, negotiation, facilitated discussions. And so during the time that we have been there, the Institute of Peace has been in Iraq, we had identified and trained and worked closely with a group of what we call Iraqi facilitators, a network of Iraqi facilitators. There's an NIF, the network of Iraqi facilitators that we trained and worked with very closely. These are Iraqis who work in their own communities, in day jobs, and then they work with us as additional work that they do with us. And the training has been useful. When the ISIS forces were pushed out of Tikrit, and Iraqi government, including the military, was ready to take back control of Tikrit, including Camp Speicher, our folks recognized that there could be real problems on revenge killing. And the symptom of that problem was the Sunni community around Tikrit was so concerned about revenge killing that they left, that they evacuated. They left their homes, went to other parts of Iraq where they thought they would be safer, and they were safer. Our folks went in and said, this is something that we, the Institute of Peace, not us as American Institute of Peace, but our Iraqi partners working closely with us, said we can do something about. So our folks who know the region, who know the city, who know the tribes, who know the personalities, know the politics, the culture, the language, the history, these are the people who can do some work for peace building. And again, this is the bottom-up work. This is the stuff at the grassroots. So they went in, our guys went in, and first sat down with the Shia tribal elders. And the Shia tribal elders that essentially represented a lot of the military forces, the Shia militia that I mentioned earlier, who had come in after ISIS was pushed out, and were in a position to have some effect, control, influence on the Shia militias and the Shia tribes that were in the region as well. Sat down with them, had conversations, also sat down separately with the Sunni tribal leaders, with the Sunni elders in the region. This went back and forth for some time. As Steve also said, some peace building work is slow. It takes time. And this took time. Eventually, after having conversations kind of one-on-one here, one-on-one there, we got them together in a series of discussions, a series of facilitated dialogues, and worked out, in the end, this took some time, but worked out an understanding, an agreement, a way forward. And the way forward was that the Sunni tribal leaders would offer up those members of their tribes who were implicated in the massacre. And they would turn them over to the Iraqi justice system, the criminal justice system. And in return, the Shia leaders agreed that they would not take revenge. They would not take tribal revenge, which would have happened and has happened. And that agreement was a great outcome. It was not foreordained. It was not obvious that that was going to happen. There have been these kinds of problems around Iraq for exactly this kind of dynamic. We've had opportunity. We've been in a lot of these places and had seen some of them work, some of them don't. But this one did. And the measure of the success, and Steve, this gets to your point about how can we demonstrate, how can we show that we've had some success. The measure is 350,000 Sunnis who had left Tikrit and gone and were internally displaced people around Iraq came back. They had enough confidence that they were not going to be killed out of revenge, that they could come back and begin rebuilding, which they are now doing. That's one small example. We've done this in other parts of Iraq, same kind of dynamic, but that is the kind of work that peace builders can do. That's using that kind of tool of dialogue, of facilitated discussions, where you have to build some confidence, you have to recognize the grievances, you have to have a joint understanding of where you're trying to get to, and then a way to sit down and do that. So hang on to that thought. That's the bottom-up thought in this two-part discussion of stories from the field. The second one, and this is the top-down one, is in Afghanistan. So a week and a half ago, I got back from a trip to both Kabul, Afghanistan, and Islamabad, Pakistan, with a delegation from the Institute of Peace. The Institute of Peace has our board of directors. We're guided by a board of directors. The board of directors, by the way, is nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and it has to be half Republicans and half Democrats. It has to be 50-50. So we, the Institute of Peace, we're not going to go off in one direction or another. We are going to be in kind of mainstream of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. security policy, because we have this bipartisan board of governors. The chairman of our board is a man named Steve Hadley, who was the national security advisor to President George W. Bush. And Steve Hadley is one of the unusual people in Washington these days who is respected by Republicans and Democrats, but even within the Republican Party, respected by the Trump people and the kind of traditional Republican people. So Steve Hadley is an unusual asset. He knows we call him an asset, so I'm not telling you stories here. He is great. As I say, respected, and he works with us really closely. So he comes over once a week. I mean, he's a busy man. But he comes over once a week and sits down with me and my boss, Nancy Lindborg, the president at USIP, and we go over a range of things. We go over things having to do with how we're going to run USIP, personnel decisions, policies, those kind of things. But we also talk about big policy issues, big national policy issues. And this is the point about Afghanistan, Steve Hadley gets involved, lends himself, works with us on a project trying to find a negotiated solution, a negotiated outcome to the war in Afghanistan. Now, he's particularly well suited to do that. While he was in office and under George W. Bush, we know what happened during both Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. So Steve knows this issue. He knows this issue. He oversaw a lot of the work, a lot of the military work, a lot of the conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq, by the way. So he and I, and the vice president for Asia in the Institute of Peace, spent this time first in Kabul, Afghanistan, and then in Islamabad, in order to take the next step to push toward a negotiated settlement. Now, I am not going to tell you, and you wouldn't believe me if I did tell you, that the Institute of Peace was the only reason that the U.S. government is now looking seriously at a negotiated outcome for the war in Afghanistan. You wouldn't believe me, and I'm not going to tell you that. We didn't, it was not, there were many people in the government and out of the government who were saying for a long time, we have to negotiate with the Taliban. We have to negotiate. We're not going to win militarily this war. Steve Hadley and I had gone there a year and a half ago and come back and made recommendations to the Trump administration on their new strategy for South Asia. And we recommended something that they were inclined to put in there anyway, which was a dual track. It was, yes, you have to keep pressure on the Taliban, but you have to negotiate. There's not going to be a military win. We're not going to defeat the Taliban. And the administration put that in their strategy a year and a half ago. We went out this year, just last week, got back last week, to evaluate that strategy and see if it were being put into effect. And we came back with some hope about the war in Afghanistan. Now, you don't usually hear those two words in the same sentence, that is hope in Afghanistan. You just don't hear it. This war has been going on 17 years. And there are, you'll pick up any paper today or yesterday or tomorrow, and there will be articles and op-eds and recommendations, people saying, just get out. It's not worth it. Don't do this. Because that argument says it's hopeless. I'm here to tell you, and I could be proven wrong in a year, but I'm here to say that there is a possibility of a negotiated outcome in Afghanistan based on what I saw with this group, with Steve Hadley and our delegation last week, that gives me some hope. And let me just tell you a little bit about that, and then I'd love to get your thoughts. There are probably people in this room who are skeptical about this observation. And I would love to have this conversation. So hang on to your skeptical thoughts here, and I'll lay it out. So first of all, one bit of evidence is for the first time in 17 years, last June, there was a ceasefire. And this ceasefire was spontaneous. It wasn't negotiated. It was not a negotiated ceasefire. It was a ceasefire that came after a religious holiday, the Eid holiday, and both sides agreed to abide by it. And they did. And that's an amazing thing, that both sides put down their weapons. Neither side attacked the other during this time. This is both the Taliban and the Afghan army and the Americans, that is the NATO forces. 3 days, no violations. Not only that, in this 3-day period, the Taliban fighters, the foot soldiers of the Taliban, came into the cities where they don't control. The Taliban control the rural areas. The government generally controls the urban areas. The Taliban put down their weapons, came into the cities, and celebrated. They celebrated with Afghan soldiers. So you had Taliban soldiers and Afghan soldiers riding around on motorbikes waving flags, taking selfies together, eating ice cream together. I mean, this was an amazing demonstration of a couple of things. One, it's possible to have a ceasefire. Two, there's a real hunger. There's a real need, desire, thirst for some kind of peace. Both sides are tired of this war, which gets to the point about, is it now possible to negotiate it out? So that's one data point. On our side, on the American side, or on the NATO side, we're kind of the leader of an alliance, the NATO coalition. We are genuinely now convinced, where we haven't been before, that negotiation with the Taliban is what we should do and have to do, and are doing. Probably many people in this room recall, and maybe even held or continue to hold the view that you can't negotiate with the Taliban. That these are terrorists, these are murderers, that they have killed Americans, they've killed a lot of Afghans, and how can we negotiate with these guys? Well, that was our view. That was the official US government view for a long time. It's no longer the view. The American government, the US government, has decided that it's not going to win this war militarily. And that was not the view as little as a year ago in the US government. And it's probably not the view still of some people in parts of the US government. But nonetheless, the US has now come to the position that we are going to negotiate. We're not going to try to win the war militarily. We're going to negotiate with the Taliban. And we've got some ideas about how to do that. That's a big change. So it's a change on the battlefield with this ceasefire. It's a change in policy on the United States side. The Afghan government, so there's another piece. So I'm telling you about stars that are kind of aligning here. And so one of the stars is the Afghan government. The Afghan government, the president, and the political parties are preparing for a presidential election. It's going to be next April 20th. And in previous elections, none of the presidential candidates ran on a platform of negotiating with the Taliban. None did. Everybody, all of these presidential candidates were pretty hardcore, pretty convinced that if we just train up the Afghan National Army better, with support from the international community, and get them capable, mobile, get them helicopters, get them more training, pay them better. If we just do all that with the military, that we'd be able to eventually win. Well, there are three main presidential candidates in Afghanistan right now. There'll be a lot more by next April, but right now there are kind of three main candidates. One, of course, is the incumbent, President Ashraf Ghani. And then there are two others, Daudzai and Hanif Atmar, who are all putting together their platforms, putting together their coalitions, putting together their tickets. A president and a vice president from the Tajik community, and another vice president from the Uzbek community, and another vice president from the Hazara community, in order to try to win support across the political landscape of Afghanistan. All three of these are running on peace. All three of these candidates are now trying to convince voters that they can bring peace to Afghanistan better than the other two. So President Ghani's trying to make that case. Hanif Atmar, who used to be Ghani's national security advisor, left him. He's now putting together a platform. He's trying to make the case that he can bring peace and negotiate with the Taliban better than Ghani. And yet a third one is doing the same thing. This is an opportunity. This is an indication, again, of what I said earlier about the need, the hunger, the thirst for an end to the war, a war weariness that is being reflected in the politics. So there are other kind of stars that are aligned. One last star, sorry, there is one last star. that I think is going to. Now they don't stay in alignment. You know, they could, as we know, they could get out. But one last star that I think is coming into line is Pakistan. So we were a while in Kabul, had these conversations with all these political, all three of these main political candidates and a bunch of others to hear about what's going on in Afghanistan. But then we went down to Pakistan. And Pakistan, as people in this room know, plays a major role in peace in Afghanistan. Some positive, some negative. There are people who are absolutely convinced, it's probably true, that the Taliban have a sanctuary in Pakistan. The Taliban can go across into Afghanistan, fight, kill people, and then retreat back into Pakistan and be protected. Probably true. Pakistan folks, you know, they don't deny this, but they say, oh, we don't really have control over the. So the Pakistanis have not played, let's just say, a positive role in the past on solving the war, solving the problem of conflict in Afghanistan. However, we sat down last week with the new prime minister. The new prime minister is a man named Imran Khan, and he's a cricket player. He's a famous cricket player. Yeah, he's 50 years old, but very fit and charismatic and confident. And he told us in our meeting with him, he said, he talked to Mr. Hadley. So Steve Hadley and I and others, so this Imran Khan, Prime Minister Khan was saying, Mr. Hadley, you can't imagine how important it is for there to be peace in Afghanistan. He said, we are desperate, and he used this word desperate twice. We are desperate for peace. Our economics are terrible. He says, we need stability on that border so that we can rebuild our economy. And the Pakistanis always worry about India. They're much less concerned about Afghanistan, but they're really worried about India. And Khan was saying, we are desperate for peace in Afghanistan. Now, so Prime Minister Khan's foreign policy advisors and the representatives from the foreign ministry who were in the room for this conversation were cringing. They were saying, oh my gosh, this is not the message that we want our prime minister to give to this visiting American delegation, that we're so desperate that we're willing to do anything to help you. But he said, I don't care what, he didn't say these words, but he said, we are desperate. And he said, we will have our military and our civilians, which are often not aligned in Pakistan, or more likely they are aligned under the military. He said, our military and our civilians will do anything we can do to help you get this war ended. Another star in the aligned constellation. So that's kind of the top-down work that we've advised U.S. government, we've advised the Afghan government, we've advised other people. This is we, the United States Institute of Peace, but others have too. You know, anytime you're doing a top-down thing, this is going to be a lot of people working on this. The U.S. government's officially working on it. We're doing it kind of unofficially. There are a lot of things that we're doing to kind of feed into that dialogue and those discussions, but there's that top-down possibility of peace in Afghanistan. Now, those two outcomes, so now just backing up, and I'm almost done here, and you guys, I look forward to you're telling me that I'm all wrong. You know, this is a mistake. You know, you guys are going about it all wrong. But this is kind of what we try to do at the Institute of Peace. We work at the bottom up, work at the grassroots, we work people to people. We try to resolve conflicts there. Not we, but again, our partners. In this case of the Iraqi partners, we try to provide resources and training and ideas about how those conflicts can be resolved. So that's the kind of the bottom-up work, which complements the work top-down, the government to government. So it's U.S. government, Afghan government, Pakistani government that's coming up with solutions to that 17-year-old war. There are other things that we can talk about that I'd be glad to do in questions and answers, but let me stop there and take your questions, take your challenges. Tell me where I'm wrong. And Jeanette's going to, all right. Okay, good. I hope.
Marcia? Sir, do you have any, does the Institute for Peace have any involvement when the U.S. is involved in a proxy war? So for example, are you working at all for peace-building activities in Yemen or in Syria? That's the first part of the question. And then secondly, do you have a role in preventing our involvement in conflict before it occurs?
Two great questions, so help me keep them in my mind. Prevention is the second one, and the first one is proxy wars. Yes, to both. So we are doing a small amount of work, mainly at the bottom-up level in Yemen, because it's hard to get into Yemen. It's the security. We can go to places where the U.S. Embassy can't, because we're not in the U.S. Embassy, so we don't have to abide by the U.S. Embassy rules. We have our own security rules and provide our own security, but we can go to places all around Afghanistan, all around Iraq. We can do some things actually a little bit in Syria. It's tricky. We're not in Lebanon, in Yemen. What we've done is provide some grants to Yemen non-governmental organizations who are doing some of this ground-up, bottom-up, peace-building kind of work. So the answer is yes, we can do some of those things. We also, I don't know if it's proxy war, but other internal conflicts, like in Libya. Same kind of thing. It's hard to work in Libya these days. We have people there. It's, again, mostly the bottom-up kind of work, people to people. There are a range of smaller efforts that we've got in other parts of Africa. But the short answer to your first question is yes, we do that kind of work where we can. Now, let me just say, Institute of Peace is small. We're 300 people. We have a nice building on the mall, by the way. If you ever visit Washington, let me know, and I will give you a tour. And if you want to, go to our website or Google us, and you'll see us. It's a nice building on the wall on the mall in Washington. But we're a small organization, and so we're not everywhere. But we are in Yemen, to answer your question. Second question is on prevention. This is a really important one. Steve pointed out, in the measures of positive peace, a lot of what we think of in terms of prevention, and that is if countries in conflict can reestablish, or in some cases establish, the bond, the connection, the responsibilities, the compact between people and government, then conflict will be much less likely and even be prevented. Where the opposite is the case, where governments can't govern, where governments can't provide services, where there's not a compact between the people and the government, those are fragile states in our terminology, similar to this measurement. That's where we see conflict a lot. And if we can address the sources of conflict, the fragility, the broken compact between the people and the governments in these fragile states, then we think we can prevent conflict. Now, measuring that is real hard, Because how can you demonstrate, how can I demonstrate to you or to the Congress that we've prevented conflict? How do you say that what we did in Libya or in Tunisia prevented conflict? We can't say that. We have a theory that we work on, but that's the harder part. The easier part, in some sense, is this top-down work where we're really working, or even the bottom-up that I described, where we're sitting down with combatants and we're trying to resolve local conflicts or even come up with a peace deal from the top. Those we can kind of come to you and we say, this is the kind of work we're doing. And the Congress says, good, keep it up. But on the prevention, it's harder. It's much harder. If you've got some ideas on this, we'd love to have them. Yes, ma'am.
Ambassador Taylor, I think what has always impressed me so much about the U.S. Institute for Peace that you're a part of is the tremendous amount of information that I've received on the importance and influence, particularly in the grassroots level, on focusing on the activities of women
Yep.
and gender.
Yep.
And in some cases, women and religion and gender.
Yep.
But I wonder if you could speak to, since this is Stories from the Field,
Yep.
most recently, I watch a lot of your live streaming and the podcasts and the events, and I'm thinking of Abigail Disney's series, PBS series on women, war, and peace building, and featuring her and the panels. So I want to commend you for that, and I'm delighted that the Institute is so cognizant of the fact, the important grassroots role that women play. Could you share with the group any examples that you might have in terms of where focus on gender or what's going on, sometimes invisibly, that women are actively doing for peace building in the countries themselves? An example for the group that might emphasize that.
Thank you for that, and thank you for tuning in to see the kinds of work we do. We are very proud of the work that we do in this area, and I think it's fair to say, I think it's accurate to say that we are among the leaders in this field with a gender program. It's not just women, by the way, it's gender, and I'll say something about that. And we've got a whole office at the Institute of Peace. You may have seen their webpage and some of their work that is focused on this. There's Kathleen Kunast leads our effort on that, and she's up at the top level of the Institute. Because the role of women in this case, which is part of the gender, in peace building is really important, and it's been demonstrated that those agreements, peace agreements, treaties, tend to last longer, be more sustained, going back to Steve's point about the positive peace, when women are involved. So two areas where we've done two examples of kind of stories from the field. One is in Colombia. So the negotiation in Colombia between the FARC and the Colombian government went on for a long time. We had one of USIP's heroes, is a woman named Ginny Bouvier, was in Colombia constantly. Again, not doing it herself, but working with Colombian women in particular, and bringing them, organizing them, helping them organize themselves, and bringing them into the discussions. As we know, the first time that the peace agreement went to the people, actually the time that the peace agreement went to the Colombians to ratify, they turned it down because there wasn't enough of this kind of buy-in. There wasn't enough of this societal agreement, which Ginny had been trying to work on. It was eventually agreed by the parliament after the first referendum. But we've had a major effect, I think, and Ginny Bouvier has, and we continue. She sadly died a year ago from some of the work she'd been doing in Colombia. But we are continuing that work in Colombia. There's another piece in Africa where we go into villages and we work with women on countering violent extremism. And the women and the mothers and the sisters have a real effect on the sons, and sadly it's mostly sons, who've been attracted to this violent extremist ideology. And we've had some, again, it's hard to measure, but we've had some effect there. But so the women in that one, the women in Colombia, many other places as well. We also make it our business to be sure that any of the events that we do in Washington, any of the panels, any of the discussions that we have, any of the work we do overseas has women in senior places, in prominent positions to be able to both speak and contribute to this kind of thing. So it's one of the areas that we feel good about what we're doing. Thank you for that. Sir.
To reduce violence, how much coordination between Institute and United Nations group going on?
It's a good question. To reduce violence, how much coordination between USIP and the UN, and the United Nations? Last week, when we were in Kabul in Afghanistan, we were very eager to sit down with the UN that has played a long time role there. So I spent a year, as Jeanette mentioned, I spent a year in Kabul back in the early days of this war, in 2002, 2003. And the UN has played a role since then. The UN was part of the original Bonn conference and the earlier attempts to put together a government and to establish a working society-government relationship. So the UN's been there for a long time. We work very closely with them. The UN has a big role to play, has played a big role in the elections, preparing for, helping to execute, monitoring the elections in Afghanistan and other places as well. Our relations with the UN in Afghanistan is probably the closest, probably the most intimate work that we're doing with them, but we do it at other places as well. We also are, again, we're very close to the US government, and because again, we're within bounds, right and left, we got Republicans and Democrats on our board, we are in the center of US foreign policy. And the US foreign policy has been, and I hope will continue, to be closely integrated with what the UN's doing. We need the UN. So the United States needs the UN to do what it needs to do in Afghanistan and in many of these other conflicts that we work on. So we're a little worried that and we had a good ambassador there, right? We had Nikki Haley. Ambassador Haley was doing a great job. She all of a sudden resigned a couple weeks ago, and so we'll see who goes in there. But short answer is we work closely with them.
Sure. So are you familiar with the research by Jones and Libicki that on how terrorist groups end, that identified some roughly 250 terrorist groups that ended between 1968 and 2006, and found that the least effective approach to terrorism was a military solution, and the most effective was negotiations. And also Chenoweth and Stephan's inventory of all the major violent and nonviolent governmental change efforts of the 20th century that found that nonviolence was much more likely to be successful and contributed positive to democracy.
Thank you. Two very good points. So I was on the plane on the way in yesterday. I'm in the middle, not quite in the middle, but in the making progress through Steven Pinker's book on Enlightenment Now. And one of the chapters he has, this is a very positive book, by the way. If you're an optimist and you want some reinforcement of your optimistic views about the world, but also about specific things, Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, take a look. He's got a chapter on peace. He argues, by the way, in general, that things are better now than they've ever been. He says that, deaths from all kinds of causes are way down. Accidents are down. Battle deaths are down. Poverty is way down. Disease is way down. When you take a look at it over a 50, 60, or even hundreds of year time frame, things are better now. Things are getting better. There is progress. Anyway, that's his Enlightenment pitch. But his chapter on peace makes exactly this point on battle deaths, on number of conflicts, in particular of great power conflicts. He said, take a look, we haven't had real great power conflicts since World War II. We did have the Korean War, and we did have this, our intervention, which I've already talked about in Iraq, which is a great power and an interstate conflict. But by and large, it's down. And getting to your point about violent extremists, even there, over the past several years, incidence of that is way down, not because we're winning on the battlefield, exactly what I was thinking about in Afghanistan, but because we recognize that there are problems in the society. There are problems that need to be addressed that makes it possible for violent extremists to do that kind of work. And I was going to cite another piece. So the violent extremists, you said, and nonviolent action. Thank you. Nonviolent action. So, like our work on gender, and I didn't get to the male part, but we do a little bit of male part in the gender role in conflict. But like Institute of Peace's work on gender, we also, I think, are on the cutting edge. We have a recognized leading effort in nonviolent action, NVA, nonviolent action. And there's a woman on our staff whose name is Maria Stefan, who's done really cutting edge work on this, and has probably used the same sources that you have.
She's a co-author with Eric Chenoweth.
Chenoweth, exactly right. They wrote the book together.
Yes.
And it makes exactly that point. That is, nonviolent opposition to dictators or oppression or corruption is much more likely to be successful than violent opposition. And she's got a lot of good reasons that make a lot of sense when you think about it. But so she's on our staff. We're very proud of her, and it's a great set of work. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So as a professor of literature, I'm particularly interested in not just the stories that we tell, but also thinking about how audiences hear those stories.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering,
how did they hear? How did audiences hear those stories? That's a good question.
well, and that's so I'm thinking about this idea of assessment and measuring as well. And are there ways that you're trying to measure how audiences hear these stories as either an anomaly that, oh, well, that's nice that it happened that time and there's no way to reproduce it, or as exemplifying the situation? And I think that is probably important both at the grassroots level, how neighbors listen to neighbors, but also at the talking to governments.
I think it's a great question. And Steve, you may have thoughts about this too, and I would love to hand this over to you. But the Institute of Peace, because we are funded by the Congress, we're funded by you, we're funded by the Congress, we have to think real hard, and we give a lot of thought to how we tell our story. And it's not, and we've found it has to be both parts of what you said. That is, we have to tell stories, we have to tell anecdotes, we have to make it concrete that people can understand, oh, this is what you did in Camp Spiker. Oh, 350,000 internally displaced people came back because of what your folks did there. And so that they say, I get it. But your point's a very good one. It's not just one-off. It can't just be one-off because there are millions of internally displaced people in Iraq. There are millions. So we have to be able to tell a broader story. We have to put it in a broader context. And so that's where, again, this office, this powerful office that we have at the Institute of Peace that does this monitoring, evaluation, and learning, tries to put those anecdotes into the context of here's what we've done across the field. And it's a lot of what Steve talked about in terms of measurements, concrete measurements, and at the outset saying this is what we're going to try to do, and here's how we're going to try to measure it. How many people came back? You know, how much money did we spend? How many people did we train? What did those people do once they were trained? So outcomes rather than just outputs. So it's that whole body of work on how to measure these things, which you need to tell a bigger story, but you have to make it real for people to tell individual stories. Steve, you must.
Yeah, in terms of peace journalism, there's a great deal of research that shows that audiences actually prefer the peace journalism approach, reporting that's non-inflammatory, reporting that seeks to build bridges rather than exacerbate us versus them divides and so on. So the seminal research in the field done by Professor Jake Lynch, and he went to 4 or 5 different countries: Australia, Kenya,
Thanks, Steve. Yes, sir.
Since there is war, for example, in Yemen, and it is enhanced by an individual or a country that comes and just bombs, you know, seeing kids flying up in the air. So how can we use justice to enhance peace?
Yemen's a really hard case. You're exactly right, but the general point about justice and peace, I think, is key. Just think about how justice figured into that one story that I told about Iraq, about Tikrit, about Camp Speicher. So the Shia tribes wanted justice. They wanted revenge. They wanted to seek revenge on the Sunni tribes that had killed 1,700 of their cadets. That was a demand for justice, for revenge. And the Sunni tribes recognized the problem and were willing to submit to justice, willing to submit to the Iraqi judicial system and put their guilty parties, you know, the young men and some of the commanders who had perpetrated that crime and others, into the justice system. So that just to say that justice is really important for peace building and for mending and resolving these disputes. Yemen is really hard. Yemen, so this actually helps make another point that I would. There are internal conflicts where the problems within a society, within a country, lead to civil war, lead to internal conflict. And so those are one set of intrastate conflicts. Then there are the interstate, and then we get the Yemen issue, where you have an outside power, or coalition in this case, led by Saudi Arabia, who is, and this gets to the proxy war question that you were asking about, who for whatever reason, intervenes from the outside. and there, the analysis and the justice component is less powerful when it's interstate, when it's an outside nation aggressing or bombing, in the case of invading a neighboring state for whatever reason. Then there are some mixed versions of this too. But the justice analysis, I think, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, the justice component of peace building is really important for the intrastate, the civil wars, the Iraqs, the Afghanistans, eventually the Syrias, in order to address that causes of the conflict. But did you have thoughts on how that works? Yeah. No, I think justice is a really important piece of what we're doing.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Taylor. He will be with us during this upcoming break and again at lunch, so feel free to approach him and continue the discussion. We're going to have a 15-minute break. The coffee has been replenished. Several organizations have set up info tables downstairs. Please feel free to stop, talk with them, see if you can join their efforts or at least be inspired by what they do. See you back here at 10:45.